Glad to see everybody out this morning. I figured you all would be at the world's longest yard sale this morning. With the repairs going on Signal Mountain Boulevard, that makes it a little harder to get up and down the mountain today. Pat, we're glad you're back. Jerry, we're glad that you have good news. Billy, we're glad you're back. I told you that you ought to put that skateboard up. But we're glad you're here today. Billy goes skating down the side of Missionary Ridge carrying a Auburn flag, so you see what that got you. Thomas, we're glad you're here today. Do what? Oh, okay. Well, you're in good company at least. Well, you came close to not having a Sunday school teacher today. We've spent a good part of the summer trying to help Phyllis's mother get resettled, get her house sold. My yard looks like it, so I worked all day in my yard, and I woke up this morning at 9 o'clock. So I appreciate the fact that we can get places in a hurry sometimes. This is the third of 3 lessons. And so some of you have had the first 2 and some of you haven't, but I'll review a little bit. 2 Sundays ago, this is my first introduction. 2 Sundays ago, we talked about how life can become very wearisome and that it can wear us out. And we ended up in a kind of a depressing place of the book of Ecclesiastes saying that things are so filled with weariness that you can't even utter it. Utter is an interesting word. It's a word that means the kind of forced last words of a dying person. And so when the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes says he can't utter the weariness that he feels with the world, it's like a last dying gasp that he's putting forward. We came back next week, I think, on a nicer note, and we said that Paul was willing to use the word weary as well, but in a very different way. And Paul challenged people to not become weary in well-doing. That we were to try to keep on doing as many things that are good as we possibly could, and that was a much better way of living than simply to get caught up in total despair. I would hope that many of you, when you saw what Paul had to say, were thinking immediately of John Wesley, talking about doing as much good as often as we can to as many people as we can. That's exactly what Paul was trying to say. And then Paul kind of caps that all off by saying that we should press on to the high calling of God in Jesus Christ. And I think that he saw pressing on as a choice that we can make. And so it's kind of like we've got the choice of a couple of lenses through which we can look at life. We can look at life through the lens of despair and agony and gloom, or we can look at life through the lens of opportunity and how we might be able to use the energies of our lives to keep on doing things that are very, very important. So that's kind of where we have been. Now I'll give you a second introduction. Thomas, you're too young, but many people in here aren't. I can remember growing up on 2 television shows that were very, very important to me that I really liked and I seldom missed. One was Dragnet. I imagine you all grew up on Dragnet, and so the character of Joe Friday I thought was just a really heroic kind of character. And Dragnet was a very settled format that you could get used to. It would start off with a crime of some kind. Then there would be a series of interviews or investigations that Joe Friday and his partner would do. And they would always be going and asking people questions. That's what I thought was fascinating in the show. Because some of the people that they would go ask questions of were characters that just kind of were in some of our families. And so at any rate, do you remember what Joe Friday would always ask people for when he investigated them or when he questioned or interrogated them?
Just the facts.
Just the facts. All he wanted was the facts. So you all had TVs too. So all he wanted was the facts. Then the other television show that we grew up on that I really enjoyed was Perry Mason. And so, I mean, you know, when you think about Raymond Burr in that role, that's one of the great roles of all the history of television. I particularly liked his secretary. Does anybody remember her name? Della Street. There you go. I think I had a little crush on Della Street. And then we'll see who the real smart people are. Do you remember his investigator that worked with him? Paul Drake. My goodness, how bright you all are this morning. There's a whole world, Thomas, that you're becoming aware of that you never knew existed. And so, at any rate, what I liked about Perry Mason was that Perry Mason would always find some piece of evidence that was undeniable. And usually in some very tense courtroom scene at the end, he would confront the criminal that was guilty with this piece of evidence that couldn't be denied, and everything would have a happy ending. As far as I know, and there's some question about this, but over 271 episodes, Perry Mason never failed to get his man, so to speak. Now, the reason that part of the lesson is important, the kind of second introduction, is that I think that we do choose lenses that we look at the world through. And we can be very negative, like Ecclesiastes, or we can be very positive with Paul. But I'm kind of inclined to think that we'd like to have the lenses through which we look at the world informed by facts and informed by evidence. And if our lenses were informed by fact and by evidence, then they might be lenses that had a great deal more clarity to them. I also kind of believe that when we think about ourselves as Americans, and when we think about all the technological and scientific advances that we've made, and when we think about all the educational advances that we have made, then we believe that we are people of fact, and we believe that we are people of evidence, and we believe that we are people like Joe Friday and Perry Mason, who kind of push to the side things that are kind of fuzzy and unclear, and focus the light of our attention on what can be proven and what can be demonstrated, what is factual, what is filled with evidence. All right, if you'll accept that, then let's go down a little short list of some facts that exist today, and some facts that are indisputable if you look at the evidence that is out there that people know about and are able to research and are able to see every day. Fact one, around the globe, improved health care has dramatically reduced infant and maternal mortality, and children are now better fed, better educated, and less abused than they've ever been. Fact number two, workers make more money, are injured less frequently, and retire earlier than they ever have in the history of the world. Fact number three, carbon intensity, the carbon footprint that we create, has been falling almost everywhere across the past 2 decades. Life expectancy has been rising. Accidental deaths are on a steep decline. Students report less loneliness and depression. The number of hate crimes in America has been falling for decades. The number of deaths by fire, in spite of what we see going on in California, has declined by 90% in America in the past century. Drug and alcohol use among youth and young adults is less than any time since the early 1970s. And now listen to this. Today, the number of people in extreme poverty fell by 137,000 people. And that has been true every single day for the past 25 years. Most forms of cancer, heart disease, other medical maladies that we used to be at the mercy of are now being challenged by medical science in ways that almost always gives people more than a fighting chance. Now, everything I've just listed here is based on fact. Everything that I have just listed here is based on very much easily verified information. But just what I've listed here doesn't sound too much like the headlines that scream at us from our televisions or the headlines that scream at us from our newspapers. That's part of the problem. We have become so connected electronically and digitally that if there is a robbery in Seattle, Washington right now, or if there's a plane crash in the Everglades right now, or if there is some kind of fire in a part of New York right now, the likelihood is that in minutes that we will be seeing that as breaking news across our televisions and consuming and taking up our lives. Sometimes all of this connectedness that is so important can cause our lives to become very scary, can cause us to want to run for the hills, or can cause us to want to arm ourselves to the maximum because of all of the bad things that are out there. We certainly live in a world in which the good sometimes is overwhelmed by the bad, and the lots of good sometimes is overwhelmed by the few bad things that find their way into our mentality. And so we get a lens created for us. And sometimes that lens that is created for us is really not all that objective. Sometimes that lens that's created for us makes us jaded, insecure, makes us negative and pessimistic about everything almost that we look at in the world. But television is not the only problem. Social medias and iPhones that beep with alerts are not the only problem. Sometimes the problem is bigger than that, and sometimes it has a great deal to do with the option of lenses that we have to look at life through. And so, I'm going to tell you something that you may not know. Every one of you in here have a metric that's associated with your lives. It's not your age, it's not your blood pressure, it's not your sugar count, all those kind of common metrics. But if you study it, you can find out that we as human beings in America today have a metric called a QOL. Did you know that you have a QOL? Well, you have a QOL. And the metric that measures QOL and all that goes into it factually in terms of scientific evidence is your quality of life. And if you look at every metric that has been assembled by research and modern scientific inquiry about our lives, we who call ourselves mostly baby boomers, every single year that we have lived since the middle 1940s, the QOL metric has improved. The quality of life that we experience as human beings, especially in this country, has improved and increased and shows no sign of doing anything else. But you have another metric, and you can add this to your list. You have an SWB metric. Did you know that? So you can go home and they can ask you, what did you learn in Sunday school today? And you can say, I learned I had an SWB metric. And the SWB metric means the sense of well-being that we experience. The subjective well-being that we experience. And especially since 2000 in America, all of the metrics that are assembled with the study of the sense of well-being that people have, those metrics have declined. And they look like they will continue to climb. Now, do you see the irony of that? We've experienced a life, most all of us, in which the quality of our life has continued to improve. And looks like it will continue to do that. But the sense of well-being about our lives the subjective sense of how we feel about ourselves in the world has declined. Isn't that strange? Doesn't that kind of demonstrate that sometimes maybe the way that we could look at life has been bent and has become jaded, that our lens maybe is not as objective and as fact-filled as it could be. Now, there's been an awfully lot of research done about this, and I'd like to report 4 or 5 of those elements, and I think this will make sense to most of us. The first explanation that is given for this irony that assaults our lives is that memory is selective, history is partial, and that the golden age always is associated with youth. And I think that's true. And so here we are, baby boomers for the most part. And as we have gotten older, tactically, life has probably gotten harder for us. We've got more aches and we've got more pains, we've got more ailments, we've got more trips to the doctors. We see too many of our friends in hospitals or mortuaries. And so as we age, tactically life gets harder. And therefore we think, oh, if I could just get to the good old days, or if I could just find some way to reclaim my youth, if I could just have some way to go back to when I was 15 years old and everything was perfect in my life, although I would challenge any one of you that life was perfect for you when you were 15 years old. Do you see what the research is saying? The research is saying that by the very nature of life, as societies age, and that as tactically life gets harder, we kind of begin to feel like that life gets badder, and that somehow life is worse, and somehow it's just going to be awful for the rest of the way through. We lose our optimism, and we lose our hope. And research says that that's happening all over America because of our aging population. Research says that that's happening all over Western Europe because of their aging population. The research says that the only large nation out there in the world today that manifests optimism is China. Now, we don't want China to beat us on production. We don't want China to beat us on gross national product. Why should we want China to beat us on optimism, or believing that the golden age is somehow out into their future, not somewhere in their past? The second explanation that research gives us, and I'm going to throw out a big word, and I don't usually do that, surrounds something called availability heuristics. Anybody wants to try to spell that? Availability heuristics. I'm sure you've used the word heuristic many times this morning. Heuristic is simply a word that talks about how we go about assessing problems and sizing up problems and then beginning to solve problems. And so, for example, if you've got Joe Friday looking just for the facts, that's a heuristic. That's the way he's going to go about sizing up his world and solving problems. If you've got Perry Mason looking for evidence, then that's his heuristic. That's the way he goes about sizing up the world and solving his problems. And so a lot of modern thinkers believe that we are assaulted today by availability heuristics. And that means when something is so available to our minds, so available to our consciousness, that we jump to the conclusion that it's probably getting ready to happen at any moment. And so, how many of y'all have had this experience? You see those poor old people looking up those stairs that they don't think they can climb anymore. And then you see those poor old people being given the miraculous opportunity of chair lifts that will take them up and down those stairs with great ease. And we see that, and we see that, and we see that, and it becomes so available to our minds that we think, I'm about to fall downstairs. I'm about to fall down these stairs. Or we see that poor old woman that's got herself all in the bathtub and all relaxed, and then she falls. And you think how awful that would be to fall in the bathtub in a house by yourself and drowned in your own bath water. And so that woman just thanks God that she can push that little button and say, I've fallen and I can't get up. And we see that happen over and over and over, and it becomes so available to our minds that we start thinking, do I really want to get in that shower? That could be a place of entrapment that I never get away from. I need to get one of those buttons as quickly as I can. And so sometimes something that just punctuates our mind all the time becomes something that we think is probably going to happen to us. And although we have not had anyone die in almost a decade in a commercial airliner crash in the United States, still people are afraid to get on airplanes. And although the odds of your being attacked by a shark in coastal waters is almost, we still get in our minds that the great white shark from Jaws is right off the shore and he's aiming at us any moment. And so we are assaulted by an availability heuristic where bad things fill our minds and we jump to the conclusion it's probably going to happen to us. We're next. Stay out of the water. Stay out the stairs. Stay out of the bathtub. And on and on. Maybe the modern researchers say we are not as objective and fact-based as we'd like to think we are. Maybe the modern researchers say that we are very, very subjective people who make more decisions with our hearts than we do with our heads, and that we're not as rational as we'd like to think. But now I'm going to really surprise you, because there's two other explanations for why we have such negative lenses. I'm really going to surprise you, because a great deal of the best modern research starts talking about not availability heuristics. That's pretty complicated. But about the sin of ingratitude. Now that is something. When's the last time you had anybody talk about the latest in modern research about anything and they started talking about the word sin? The sin of ingratitude. And the way that that is expressed is our incessant compulsion as modern people to complain. To see the glass half empty, to complain. And I've never associated complaining with the sin of ingratitude. But maybe when we find ourselves overwhelmed by complaint, maybe we are failing to see the beauty of the day and the beauty of the people that are around us and the beauty of opportunity that we have. A lack of gratitude can make us jaded and can make us look in very negative ways at our world and the people in it. And finally, and this is what jumped off the page at me, in the modern research that talks about the kind of lenses that we choose to look at life through, modern researchers are saying that fewer people attend worship services where they can hear messages of promise and hope, and where they can interact in positive ways with other people. Now that should blow your mind, because you've not heard any modern researchers reflecting on the scientific details of evidence of our days that are saying one of our problems is that we don't attend enough worship services where we hear messages of promise and hope, and where we have the opportunity to have relationships with people that are positive and that are good for us. I do think, however, that assumes a lot. Because sometimes in the modern church, sometimes more of the messages are divisive, and more of the messages are messages that just parrot whatever political power is in control. In the modern church, we hear too many reasons sometimes not to like other people or to accept other people and to benefit from the relationships that we have with them. I think we should thank God that we can come to a place like First-Centenary, and that we can come and sit, I hope, in a class like this, and that we can hear realities that relate to hope, and that we can hear realities that relate to promise, that we're not just consumed with political diatribe, and that we have the chance to be around people that we can integrate with, that we enjoy and we like to be around. It could be that those kind of dynamics would help us more than we would ever believe in terms of the way that we live in the world. I'll conclude. There's a guy named Charles Mann. And Charles Mann's an interesting young writer. And Charles Mann says we have two different personalities that are out there that we have a chance to listen to. And these will influence us. Charles Mann says we have people out there today who are prophets, or who call themselves that, and that these prophets are almost doomsday voices that are all of the time talking about how the end of the world, the apocalyptic moment, a downhill slide that will overwhelm all of us, is right around the corner. He features one modern voice who says that the world is like a giant laboratory petri dish that is filled with bacteria. And these bacteria are growing at a rapid rate, and they will finally die and be choked out in their own waste. I hope that's not right. I hope our world is not like a growing bacteria that will choke itself out in our own way. But man says that's the prophetic attitude. And then Charles Mann says, but there are also wizards. And that's a word that my grandchildren use because they know about Harry Potter, and some of you do. Or those are words that I guess we've slipped up on if we've seen Star Wars and we appreciate Yoda. The wizard is different from man. The wizard is a young voice. And the wizard says, there is plenty out there that we should feel good about and have gratitude for. There's plenty out there that is positive, that can give us positive energy in our lives. And if we live in gratitude, and we live in hope, and we live in promise, that we begin to assimilate a power that will allow us to live in a hard world, and maybe even to transform it. If you take going into life as if it were opportunity, and now if you take going into life with a sense of gratitude, maybe those two powers can become more prominent and more forceful than all the negativity and all the complaint and all the fearfulness that daily assaults our lives. Maybe we, of all people who call ourselves Christian, should more easily find reasons to see life as opportunity and to experience life through the lens of gratitude. Paul gives us our final thought. Maybe Paul was a wizard. And our benediction in the letter to Colossians, where he says, be thankful, be filled with gratitude, and then the peace of God will rule in your hearts. Get it? The peace of God can rule in our hearts if we look at life as opportunity and if we approach life with gratitude. That's the lens we put on if we're true believers. May God help us to alter the lens through which we engage the world. May God help us not to let our lens, allow our lens to become so jaded that we become filled with complaint and fear. May God help us see and reject those who would give us jaded lens, make us feel division with each other, and bring such great control to our lives. May God help us to reject deceiving prophets of doom and find wizards, those who are thankful, those who still see opportunity, those who manifest gratitude, and those still capable of understanding that love is the most powerful force in all of existence. Opportunity, gratitude, a different lens that opens the door for us to love. If I've ended up sounding like an old hippie today, then forgive me. In fact, I don't really want forgiveness for sounding like an old hippie. I'd rather be interested in going out into the sunset singing what the world needs now is love, sweet love. Or maybe peace like a river so gently is flowing. What marvelous, wonderful, glorious peace. Let us pray. God, help us that your peace might rule in our hearts. And in doing so, that we might find a greater sense of opportunity in our daily living and a greater sense of gratitude for all that we have. Help us that the lens through which we experience life might not become so jaded. Help us that we might realize that there's a lot of golden age that still can be experienced in our futures. So help us to go out, our Father, with our viewpoint transformed. And we pray that it might be more that of Jesus, more that of Paul, and that we might press forward to the goal of the high calling of God shown us in Jesus Christ. For we pray in his holy name. Amen. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you. Charles, you got any words of wisdom you'd like to share before we leave?
Go forth and do good.
That's about right.